Kremlin's most prominent critic, Alexei Navalny, is reportedly missing from the prison he was lodged miles away from Moscow. Navalny's lawyers claim they tried to reach out to him in the 2 penal colonies where he was believed to be imprisoned, but could not find him. The opposition leader has been missing for the last 6 days and his whereabouts remain unknown. Moreover, Navalny's name is also missing from the list of the prisoners. This development comes days after President Vladimir Putin decided to run for the 2024 presidential election. US has also now expressed its concerns about the whereabouts of the opposition leader. Now, Navalny, it should be noted, was sentenced to 9 years in prison in August this year after he was found guilty of creating an extremist community financing extremist activities. Well, that's what the Kremlin had to say. And numerous other crimes, according to the Kremlin. He has been jailed more than 10 times and has spent hundreds of days in custody since the year 2011. And with that, let me also break down for you about Navalny's disappearance and how his days in prison have been. Navalny has been jailed more than 10 times, as I told you, since the year 2011. He spent hundreds of days in custody since 2011. Remember, it's been pretty much back and forth for him behind and outside behind the bars. Guilty of creating an extremist community. As we all know, he has been an opposition leader. He's been sentenced to 19 years in prison in August 2023. So he was in prison for all these months and has now gone missing. On that note, let's also bring you what the US State Department spokesperson has to say.
We do not have any information about his whereabouts. We are deeply concerned for Mr. Navalny's well-being after his lawyers have stated that they have not been able to contact him for almost a week now, and after he did not appear at his scheduled court appearance today. We have communicated to the Russian government that they are responsible for what happens to Mr. Navalny while he's in their custody, and they will be held accountable by the international community. We have repeatedly joined Mr. Navalny's family, his colleagues, his supporters around the world in calling for his immediate release without conditions, and for the Russian government to end its continued repression of independent voices in Russia who are subject to relentless harassment and intimidation for exercising their human rights, and will continue to follow the cases of everyone in Russia who has been illegally detained.
All right, so that was the US reaction coming in. On that note, let's also try and get in a sense of perspective in terms of what this means in Russia. And for that, let me introduce my guest today. I'm joined in by Michael Baker, who's the host of the President's Daily Brief podcast, and he's also the former CIA Covert Operations Officer. Many thanks to you, Mr. Baker, for joining in. I'd like your thoughts as far as the timing of Navalny's missing is concerned, because the fact of the matter is just days ago, last week, we learned that President Putin will now be bidding for a record 5th term in Russia.
Yeah, there's a surprise. And one can only wonder if Putin will be successful and win his 5th term. Look, I think there's little that happens that's coincidental in Putin's regime. And Navalny's his supporters have pointed this out. They said the idea that there is just a random coincidence between Putin announcing that he's going to be running for president again, which would put him as president of Russia at least until 2030. And then suddenly Navalny goes missing, and it's been a week now at this point. I think it's just yet another example of Putin looking to silence an individual who really has been his strongest vocal critic.
It's interesting that you call him a strongest vocal critic, because we are aware that Navalny campaigned from prison against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He also attempted to mobilize public opinion against Putin, and he was doing all of this from behind the bars. Why is Alexei Navalny still a thorn in Putin's side if he is in prison?
Well, because he's been able, through his supporters who have mounted various anti-Putin campaigns, if you want to call them that, on the outside, he has been able to continue rallying this support. Look, he stands out. He's unique in the sense that, as you know, there are very few vocal critics of Putin. They don't tend to last very long. You look at everyone from Alexander Litvinenko to Sergei Skripal. They have had a tendency to utilize the Russian intel services toxin teams to chase down and terminate any real critics that are operating out there in the world. So the fact Navalny is in prison, yes, you would think, okay, well, that takes care of him. Now Putin can worry about other critics, but there's really not that many other vocal critics. And Navalny has been able to still have a voice from inside prison. Although, again, right now, the concern on the international community's part is, where is he?
True, absolutely, because that's what brings me to my next question. In December 2020, Vladimir Putin said that if the Russian security service had to actually kill Navalny, they would have finished the job. Russia, at the same time, has denied involvement in Navalny's poisoning. But after seeing how dissent is treated in Russia, and you mentioned some of those names as well, most recent being that of Prigozhin, what are the possible reasons for keeping Navalny alive?
Well, his profile, for one, I think within the international community, and I'm not saying that Putin sees terminating him as a bridge too far, but I think it has somehow protected Navalny somewhat from, at this point, suffering the same fate as someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin or, again, Litvinenko and a host of others who have been killed, mostly poisoned. Look, your CNN did a very good investigation into that poisoning in Navalny and made the determination with solid evidence that the FSB, the Russian intel service, had been involved in that and had poisoned him with Novichok prior to a flight to Siberia. So, but your question is a good one. Why is he still alive? Well, hopefully he is still alive. Look, Putin has, he's in a very interesting position. You could argue that his support internally inside Russia is very strong. I mean, if you believe the polls, but at the same time, his future in part depends on how Ukraine plays out. And right now, that's a very complex issue.
Very well said. Michael Baker, my last question to you. The White House has said that it's deeply concerned about reports of Navalny's disappearance, but one wonders, how much can the United States or even the entire international community do at large?
That's a great question. And the answer is, not to be overly cynical, but the answer is they can do very little. Look, what are we going to do? From a U.S. administration perspective, they'll express their concern. They'll hold them accountable. Mean Russia still has a seat on the permanent UN Security Council after having invaded Ukraine and engaged in war for almost going into its third year. They've poisoned and killed opponents of Putin. Look, there's this idea that somehow we're going to be watching closely and holding them accountable. To your point, there's very little that in reality we can do that will influence Putin's perspective or his actions.
Absolutely. A very sad day for politics in Russia, for sure. Many thanks to you, Michael Baker, for joining in with your precious insights here on CNN News 18. Thoroughly appreciate.
Thank you.
Now, Navalny's supporters have repeatedly claimed the opposition leader was thrown into jail because he posed one of the biggest political threats to Vladimir Putin. Navalny went missing just ahead of 2024 presidential elections. He was last seen 3 days before Putin announced his run for his 5th presidential term. We break down the details for you in this report.
Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny has been removed from the penal colony where he had been imprisoned since last year, his allies said on Monday. They say his current whereabouts are unknown. They refuse to say where he was transferred, Navalny's spokesperson posted on social media after speaking with staff at the IK6 facility east of Moscow. Aides have been preparing for his expected transfer to a, quote, special regime colony, the harshest grade in Russia's prison system, after he was sentenced in August to an additional 19 years in prison on top of the more than a decade he was already serving. There was no immediate comment from the Kremlin. His disappearance comes at the start of the campaign period for a presidential election in which Vladimir Putin confirmed he would run for another 6-year term. With the Kremlin in full control of state media and able to decide who can and cannot run, the Navalny camp says this is not a real election. Hours after the election announcement last Thursday, the opposition camp posted photos on social media of giant blue billboards it had placed in major cities. Under an innocent-looking greeting of Russia Happy New Year were QR codes leading to Navalny's Not Putin website. But the impact was brief as authorities took down the billboards and blocked access to the site. Russian authorities view Navalny and his supporters as extremists, with links to Western intelligence agencies intent on trying to destabilize Russia. Navalny is by far the best-known figure in Russia's opposition. For years, he has branded Putin and the ruling elite as a gang of crooks and thieves, lampooning them in slick videos watched millions of times on YouTube.